Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Grunberg, when you spoke with my staff last week, you expressed support for providing other FDIC board members with the resources necessary for them to hire staff, including staff from outside the FDIC. In fact, you noted that in your previous tenure as chairman, you had allowed an FDIC board member to hire a non-FDIC employee to advise him, and you remarked that this arrangement was positive both for the member and for the board as a whole. So, if you're confirmed, will you commit to providing all other FDIC board members with similar resources and hiring flexibility?
Yes. Yes, Senator.
I appreciate that because I know you recognize the importance that staff play in the decision-making process. So I appreciate that commitment. It's my understanding that the FDIC has an internal policy that requires that meeting materials, excuse me, that meeting materials be circulated to FDIC board members at least 2 weeks prior to the board meetings. Now, I understand that hasn't always been observed in practice, but that is the policy. Can you commit to abiding by this deadline, including on interagency matters, to make sure that all board members have the opportunity to review relevant material before board consideration?
Senator, I'll certainly commit to doing our best on that. We generally meet that deadline. If we don't, we consult with the other members of the board. And frankly, if there's ever an issue with a board member feeling they haven't had sufficient time to consider a matter, then we would, if necessary, delay action on it until all the members of the board feel comfortable that they've had a full opportunity to consider the matters that the board has to act upon.
Well, I appreciate that, and I hope you'll be able to stick to that because it becomes, as you know, it can be impossible to properly evaluate and cast a decision about an important matter. The things you deal with are so complex and have so many nuances that it just requires that time for preparation. Still with Mr. Grunberg, now your involvement in forcing out former FDIC Chair McWilliams was very disturbing to me. As you know, I've talked to you about this. Are you aware of a single previous instance in the FDIC's nearly 90-year history in which non-chairman board members sought to take control of the agency's agenda?
We certainly have had instances when I was chairman when other members of the board put forward proposals, and there has been instances in the past in which other members of the board have proposed cases at a board meeting. So, and it is this common practice at board meetings, at the conclusion of board meetings, for the chairman to ask the other members of the board if there are any other matters that members would like to raise. So let me...
Go ahead.
So just I think the general practice is to defer to the chairman on setting the agenda, but every member of the board is obviously an independent member with the ability and to a certain degree responsibility to put forward proposals that they believe are in the public interest.
Okay, but my actual question was there a time when the board members took control of the agenda against the will of the chair, overruling essentially the will of the chair? And we've done the research, and we can't find any such time. In fact, in 2018, the board consisted of you as acting chairman and 2 Republicans, Joseph Otting and Mike Mulvaney. Now, I'm pretty sure there must have been occasions where those 2 Republicans disagreed with you on various matters. But again, there's never been an occasion where they took control of the agenda, overruled you, and pursued their own agenda. So I'm concerned that what you and some of your colleagues did really undermines the FDIC and could have lasting implications. Let me move on quickly here to your announcement on the very first day as acting chairman at the FDIC that the FDIC would join the so-called Network for the Greening of the Financial System. Now, this group has an explicit mission to, and I quote, mobilize mainstream finance to support the transition toward a sustainable economy, end quote. In other words, their stated goal is to allocate capital in such a way as to accelerate a transition to a low-carbon economy. Now, you've recently acknowledged that capital allocations decisions should be made by banks. So do you believe it would be appropriate for the FDIC to seek to play a role in determining the pace of the transition of our economy to a lower carbon economy.
That's not our responsibility, Senator.
I'm glad to hear that, but I want to remind you that that's exactly what the mission of the Network for the Greening of the Financial System is. And so we have U.S. financial regulators acknowledge the indisputable fact that they don't have the authority to set climate policy, but then they join an organization that's dedicated to doing exactly that. So I would suggest withdrawing from the group as a way to acknowledge the limited nature of the powers of the FDIC. I've got very little time remaining, but very quickly, Mr. Hill, this is, of course, a multi-member bipartisan board. If you are confirmed, could you briefly talk about some of the bipartisan work that you've done in the past that prepares you for this role?
Sure. Thank you, Senator.
And then I'd like to ask Mr. McKiernan essentially the same question, if you can answer the same question.
When I was a staff member for the Senate Banking Committee, I participated in the work on a number of bipartisan bills. When I first started working for the committee, we were working on the FHA Solvency Act, which was marked up and approved by the committee, I believe, by a 23-to-1 vote. I then did a lot of work on the Johnson-Crapo housing finance reform legislation, which also was marked up by the committee and passed by a bipartisan vote. And of course, there was S-2155, which also was signed into law with a bipartisan vote.
Yes, Senator, briefly, similarly, some work on S-2155 when I was working for Senator Corker. And perhaps also note there was a lot of bipartisan effort led by Senator Corker's office on Housing Finance Reform Office. I think at some point we had, as part of our group, our working group on this, staff from 6 Republican offices and 6 Democratic offices on this committee. So I think there's a lot of creative problem solving there and learning how to work on a bipartisan basis.
Thank you, and I want to thank all of the witnesses for their public service and willingness to serve. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.